The year 1618 arrived like a cold shadow over Europe. This wasn't a continent of nations as we know them today, but a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of 300 different states, each with its own prince, its own laws, and its own version of God. It was a powder keg of religious hatred and political greed, waiting for a single spark to blow the entire house down. That spark didn't come from a battlefield. It came from a window. In the heart of Prague, inside the cold stone walls of the Hradčany Palace, a group of Protestant lords had finally run out of patience. Facing them were two Catholic regents, the necessary monsters representing the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. These men were the iron face of an empire that wanted to erase the Protestant soul of Bohemia. The tension in the room was thick. You could hear the heavy breathing, the creak of leather boots, and the low, dangerous word tune of men who knew that blood was about to be spilled. The Protestants didn't draw their swords. A simple execution wasn't enough. They wanted a performance. They grabbed the imperial officials, dragged them across the floor, and heaved them out of a window 70 feet above the ground. This is known as the Defenestration of Prague. As those men tumbled through the air, the structural integrity of Europe went with them. Legend says they landed in a massive pile of horse manure, surviving the fall, but starting a fire that would consume 8 million lives over the next 30 years. If the survivors called it a miracle, the rest of Europe was about to call it a curse. This wasn't just a local riot, it was the opening bell for the Great Attrition. Before we descend into the smoke of a war that turned humans into predators and neighbors into monsters, if you're fascinated by how a single act of defiance can bankrupt an entire civilization, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We don't just tell stories, we hunt for the hidden truths in the wreckage of history. Join our ranks today or be left behind in the mist. To understand why a 70-foot drop triggered 3 decades of hell, we have to look at the Baltic-style complexity of the Holy Roman Empire. For years, a fragile paper peace called the Peace of Augsburg had held the continent together. The rule was simple: cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. If your prince was Catholic, you were Catholic. If he was Lutheran, you were Lutheran. But this system was an Archimedes lever with a broken fulcrum. It ignored the Calvinists, the radicals, the Ivars of the religious world who refused to be silent. And it ignored the rising ego of the Habsburg family. They didn't want a jigsaw puzzle, they wanted a monolith. They wanted to turn the empire into a single Catholic command bunker where no one dared to defy the emperor's will. The man holding the matches was Ferdinand II. He wasn't a man of compromise, he was a man of Khalji-style obsession. Educated by Jesuits to believe that mercy was a defect, he once declared he would rather rule a desert than a land full of heretics. When he took the throne of Bohemia, he didn't just govern, he attacked. He closed churches, burned books, and sent his spies into the markets to choke the life out of his subjects' freedom. The men who threw his officials out the window weren't just angry, they were fighting for survival. They knew that if Ferdinand stayed in power, their world wouldn't just be changed, it would be liquidated. As the bruised regents limped back to Vienna, the word tune of Europe shifted from prayers to the sound of sharpening steel. In Prague, the Protestants didn't wait for a reply. They raised an army, invited a new winter king to lead them, and effectively declared war on the most powerful dynasty in the world. They thought they were being brave. They thought they were the hunters. They didn't realize they had just walked into a bear trap. The monstrous fleet of the Catholic League was already moving. The merchants of death were counting their silver. The window was open, the nobles had fallen, and Europe was about to jump right after them. This was the day science, religion, and brute force collided, and the result would be the suicide of a continent. As the dust settled in the castle ditch of Prague, the smell of gunpowder began to drift across the borders of Germany. The window to hell was open, and through it stepped a new kind of nightmare. The war was no longer just about whose God was the true one. It was turning into a business, a cold, Khalji-style machine where human life was the only currency that didn't matter. Imagine a soldier who doesn't know the name of the king he's fighting for. He doesn't know a single prayer, and he doesn't care about the borders on a map. He only cares about two things: the weight of the silver in his pocket and the sharpness of the pike in his hand. By 1620, the war had outgrown the men who started it. It needed a manager. It needed a monster. Enter the mercenary captains. These were the Ivars of the 17th century. They realized in a crumbling Europe, war was the most profitable industry on earth.
They didn't lead armies, they owned them. They were the CEOs of slaughter. And the most terrifying of them all was a man named Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was a minor noble who saw the war not as a tragedy, but as a bank vault waiting to be cracked. He was an Archimedes of logistics. He went to the Holy Roman Emperor with a deal that sounded like a miracle. I will give you an army of 50,000 men, and it won't cost you a single cent in wages. How? Wallenstein had discovered a dark mathematical secret. War must feed war. He realized that you didn't need a treasury if you had enough boots on the ground. His army didn't wait for supply wagons. Instead, they moved like a monstrous fleet across the land, liquidating every village they passed. He invented a system of systematic extortion. If a city wanted to avoid being burned to the ground, they had to pay a contribution tax. Wallenstein used that money to buy more guns, which he used to collect more taxes. It was a Baltic-style cycle of predator and prey. He turned the heart of Europe into a giant machine designed to swallow itself.
Before we see how Wallenstein turned the continent into a graveyard, if you want to understand how the business of death reshaped our world, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We go beyond the history books to show you the gears of the machine. Don't just watch history happen, understand why it happened. Wallenstein wasn't just a businessman, he was a necessary monster. He was so efficient that even the emperor who hired him began to fear him. He lived in a state of Khalji-level paranoia, surrounded by astrologers and spies. He didn't trust the stars, and he certainly didn't trust men. By 1625, Wallenstein's private army was the only gravity holding the Catholic cause together. He had cleared the board of almost every Protestant threat. He had turned the jigsaw of hate into a single blood-soaked empire. The Protestant princes were running. The Winter King was a memory. It looked like the war was over. The trap is set. But in the world of war before law, victory is often just a mask for a bigger disaster. Wallenstein's success was his own beached longship. He had become too powerful. The other Catholic princes hated him. The emperor was jealous of him. And across the Baltic Sea, a mirror match was preparing to sail. A new king was watching the smoke rise from Germany. He was watching Wallenstein turn the coast into a fortress. He knew that if he didn't move now, he would be the next one on the lottery of death. The merchants of death had had their turn. Now it was time for the lion to roar. The first major collision of this apocalypse didn't happen in a grand cathedral or a royal court. It happened on a cold, foggy slope just outside of Prague in 1620. This was the Battle of White Mountain. On one side stood the Protestant rebels, men who thought they were fighting for freedom. On the other side stood the monstrous fleet of the emperor's professional killers. The battle didn't last all day. It didn't even last the morning. In just 2 hours, the professional discipline of the Catholic forces smashed the Protestant lines like a hammer hitting glass. The Winter King, the man the rebels had chosen to lead them, didn't stay to fight. He packed his bags and fled in the middle of the night, leaving his subjects to face the music alone. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a total collapse of the Protestant dream. But if you think the war ended with that battle, you don't know the man holding the leash. Ferdinand II didn't just want a victory, he wanted an Ivar-style performance of terror. He didn't see the rebels as enemies to be negotiated with, he saw them as a disease that had to be cut out. He ordered his men to seize the leaders of the rebellion. He put them on trial in the town square of Prague and executed 27 of them in a single morning. This was Kalji-level cruelty, a message carved in blood for everyone to see. If you are starting to see how brute force can be used to humiliate an entire nation, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We don't just look at who won, we look at the psychological virus that keeps the war burning. Join us as we track the trail of iron across Europe. Ferdinand didn't stop at executions. He began a Baltic-style erasure of the Protestant culture. He took the lands of the rebels and gave them to his loyal mercenary captains. He forced every Protestant priest to leave the country. He told the common people they had 2 choices, become Catholic or leave everything they owned and march into exile. Thousands chose the road, walking away from their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The emperor thought he had won. He thought he had turned the jigsaw of hate into a single Catholic monument. But he had made the same mistake the Romans made at Syracuse. He had been too successful. By being so cruel, he had turned a local fight into an existential struggle. The neighboring kings began to look at the smoke rising from Bohemia and realized that the monstrous fleet of the Habsburgs was coming for them next. The paper peace was dead. The necessary monster of Wallenstein was getting richer, and far to the north, the lion was sharpening his claws. The war wasn't ending, it was just finding its rhythmic pulse. The hunters were about to discover that the prey had invited a giant to the table. While the emperor was busy celebrating his victory in Prague, a new shadow was growing over the Baltic Sea. The Catholic world thought the fight was over, but they had forgotten about the Viking-style warriors of the north. In 1630, a monstrous fleet appeared on the German coast. Thousands of men stepped onto the sand, and at their head was Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. History calls him the Lion of the North, but to the Romans of his time, he was something much more dangerous. He was an Archimedes of the battlefield. Gustavus didn't just bring more men, he brought a superior mind. He realized that the old way of fighting, massive, slow blocks of soldiers, was a beached longship. He redesigned everything. He made his cannons small and light enough that 2 men could pull them through the mud. He gave his soldiers shorter, faster muskets. Most importantly, he taught them to fire in word-tune volleys, one line of men kneeling, one standing, all firing at once. It wasn't just a battle, it was a machine of lead. If you want to see how one man's terrifying creativity can stop an empire, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We analyze the moments where intelligence shatters brute force. Join our digital army and never miss a beat of the action. The Catholic generals scoffed at him. They called him a snow king who would melt when he moved south. They sent their most legendary commander, Count Tilly, to crush him. Tilly was a veteran who had never known defeat, the sword of Rome in this era. The two forces met at the Battle of Breitenfeld. The Catholics used the old tertio system, huge squares of 3,000 men moving like slow dinosaurs. Gustavus used his new flexible lines. What happened next broke the mind of every Catholic soldier who witnessed it. The Swedes moved with unnatural fluidity. Every time the Catholics tried to charge, the Swedish cannons were already there, moved by hand to meet them. The Swedish musketeers fired so fast and so accurately that the Catholic squares were turned into an unrecognizable pulp of flesh and metal. By the end of the day, the invincible Catholic army was erased. Tilly was wounded and fleeing. The Snow King hadn't melted, he had become an avalanche. But the lion knew that in the world of war before law, success has a price. He had become the gravity of the Protestant world. Every king who hated the emperor was now looking to him for salvation. He was no longer just a king of Sweden, he was the master of Germany. But across the field, the necessary monster Wallenstein was watching. He had been called back by the emperor to stop the lion. The stage was set for the ultimate mirror match. The two greatest minds of the century were about to collide in the fog. The year was 1632, and the air over Germany was so thick with the smell of sulfur and wet earth that it felt like breathing through a shroud. The Lion of the North, Gustavus Adolphus, was no longer just a king, he was a god of war. But he was about to face the only man who could match his Archimedes-style brain. Albrecht von Wallenstein had been brought back from retirement. The emperor was desperate. The necessary monster was the only shield left. These two giants finally crashed into each other at the Battle of Lutzen.
It was a morning of unnatural silence. A heavy, cold fog crawled across the fields, hiding the two armies from each other. You couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. It was a Baltic-style nightmare where your eyes were useless and only your ears could tell you where death was coming from. When the sun finally tried to break through, the word tune of the battle began. Thousands of muskets fired into the mist, hitting targets they couldn't even see. The ground didn't just vibrate, it groaned under the weight of the most professional killers in the world. If you are fascinated by the moments where the unstoppable object finally hits the immovable object, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We go into the heart of the fog to find the truth behind the legends. Join us as we witness the fall of the giants. Gustavus, as always, refused to lead from the back. He was the Ivar of his men, the hand that directed the weapon. He rode into the thickest part of the fog, trying to push his cavalry through the Catholic lines. But the fog was a mirror-match trap. In the confusion, the king got separated from his guards. He rode straight into a group of imperial horsemen. They didn't see a king, they just saw a target. A bullet smashed into his arm. Another hit his horse. As he fell into the mud, a soldier asked who he was. "I am the King of Sweden," he whispered.
They answered him with a sword to the chest. The Lion of the North was dead. But his death didn't stop the battle. It turned it into a Khalji-style massacre. When the Swedish soldiers realized their king had fallen, they didn't run. They went into a berserker rage. They charged through the fog like demons, screaming the king's name. They smashed into Wallenstein's lines with a violence that defied military logic. By the time the sun set, Wallenstein was forced to retreat. The Swedes had won the field, but they had lost their soul. The gravity that held the Protestant world together was gone. The necessary monster, Wallenstein, had survived, but he was broken. He began to realize that the war had become a beached whale, too big to win, too heavy to move. He started making his own secret deals with the enemy, trying to find a Syracuse-style exit. But the emperor's spies were everywhere. In 1634, the emperor decided that his monster was more dangerous than the enemy. Wallenstein was assassinated in his bedroom by his own officers. The two greatest minds of the war were both in the grave. Now the war had no brain. It only had a stomach, and it was hungry for the rest of Europe. With the giants dead, the war should have ended. But the 30 Years' War was no longer a human conflict. It had become a Khalji-style machine that functioned on its own dark logic. By 1635, the religious masks were thrown away. This was the era of the carnival of death. The armies were no longer fighting for God or kings. They were roaming the countryside like a plague of locusts. Because the treasuries were empty, the soldiers lived on the land, which meant they lived on the people. Imagine a Baltic-style shadow falling over every farm in Germany. If you were a peasant, the sound of a horse wasn't a sign of trade, it was a death sentence.
The soldiers developed a terrifying creativity for torture. They practiced the Swedish drink, where they forced dirty manure water down a farmer's throat until his stomach bloated, just to make him reveal where he had hidden his last silver coin. They weren't fighting an enemy, they were liquidating a population to keep themselves fed. If you want to see the physical receipt of what happens when war loses its soul and becomes a business of misery, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We go deep into the dark corners of history where the rules of humanity are erased. Join our ranks and witness the true cost of the great attrition. The irony was absolute. The fields that once fed Europe were now graveyards. Because there were no farmers left to plant seeds, the hunger began to do what the cannons could not. Cannibalism, once a story told to scare children, became a daily reality. In the walled cities, people sold the leather from their shoes for food. They ate their horses, then their dogs, and eventually they looked at the bodies in the streets. 1/3 of the population of Germany vanished, not from the sword of Rome, but from the simple, brutal absence of bread. As the structural integrity of society dissolved, the necessary monsters changed. Now it was the Cardinal Richelieu of France who held the leash. Even though he was a leader of the Catholic Church, he didn't care about the Pope's victory. He was an Ivar-style pragmatist. He wanted to see Germany and the Emperor broken so that France could be the new gravity of Europe. He began pouring money and fresh men into the fire, making sure the war never stopped. He was the architect of a mirror match that had no end. Europe had become a beached longship stuck in the mud of its own making.
The kings were safe in their palaces, but the people were living like the Curonian tribes, hiding in the deepest forests and the deepest swamps. They became like the Curonian tribes, silent, suspicious, and dangerous. They learned to move without making a sound and to kill any soldier that wandered too far from his unit. The irony was complete. The civilized world of Europe had returned to a state of primal, Ivar-style survival, where the only law was the one you carried in your hand. Even the generals began to feel the weight of the beached longship they were steering. They were winning battles, but there was nothing left to conquer. They were taking cities, but the cities were just piles of ash. The gravity of the war was finally pulling everyone down. In the royal courts of Paris, Vienna, and Stockholm, the word tune finally began to change. They realized that if they didn't stop, there would be no Europe left to rule. The predators were finally exhausted by the endless hunt. The stage was being set for the final physical receipt of the war. After 30 years of putting war before law, the leaders of Europe were forced to crawl to a table and try to find a way to live in the graveyard they had created. They were looking for a Syracuse-style peace, not because they had found mercy, but because they had run out of blood to spill. By the year 1640, the necessary monsters in the palaces realized they were ruling over a graveyard. The grand fleet of the Holy Roman Empire was broken, and the Swedish lion was long dead. Europe was a beached longship that had run out of food, money, and men. The leaders finally decided to do something they hadn't done in 30 years: talk. They gathered in 2 small towns in a region called Westphalia. This was the Peace of Westphalia, the final physical receipt of 30 years of suicide.
The negotiations didn't take days, they took years. The diplomats were like the Archimedes of politics, trying to find a new structural integrity for a broken continent. They had to solve a jigsaw of hate that had millions of pieces missing. But as they sat at those tables, they created the world we live in today. They invented the sovereign state. They decided that a king or a government owns their own land, and no Ivar-style invader or Sword of Rome pope could tell them what to do inside their own borders. If you want to understand how the modern world was born from the smoke of 8 million graves, hit that like button and subscribe to War Before Law. We look at the mirror match of history to see how today's laws were written in yesterday's blood. Join our digital army and keep questioning the narrative. The irony of Westphalia is that it wasn't a peace of love, it was a peace of the grave. It was a cold, mechanical agreement because everyone was too tired to lift a sword. The word tune of Europe changed forever. The era of religious wars was over, and the era of the nation had begun. The necessary monster of the state had replaced the necessary monster of the church. When the bells finally rang for peace in 1648, the survivors crawled out of the forests and the swamps. They looked at a Germany that was a Syracuse-style ruin. The gravity of the war had cleared the old forest, allowing the single strong oak of the modern world to grow. 8 million people had died to prove one Kalji-level truth. When you put war before law, the only winner is the dirt. The 30 Years' War was Europe's suicide, but it was also its rebirth. The lion and the monster are gone, but the lines they drew in the mud with their blood are the borders we still live by. The physical receipt is clear. We traded our souls for our countries. And as you walk through the cities of modern Europe, remember that beneath the pavement, the circles of Archimedes and the bones of Ivar are still there, whispering the cost of our survival.